through Spore, which is a new library I've written based on the Slim framework. Spore is a library that extends Slim and adds a few extra little utilities to make writing REST APIs very quick and easy, and provides a few little utilities to make the whole experience a little bit more pleasurable. So I'm going to just take you through it. Spore is available as a composer package, and you can go through to Packagist and you'll see that there is a project here. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to grab the composer executable, and I'm going to go into a new folder that I've created here and run that command. That's going to download the composer executable, which will allow us to download the Spore project and all of its dependencies. So now I'm going to go into my trusty IDE, PHP Storm, and open up the Spore test directory. And you'll see that we've just got the FAR file in here. So if we now go and add a composer.json file, we can just add in what we need to get started with Spore. And we're going to be working out of the dev master branch. So now that we've got that, we can go to our command line, php composer.var install. Okay, so now that we have all of our dependencies and we have Spore, we can get started. So we'll see that Composer now added a vendor folder for us with Slim and some libraries that I've provided. So I'm going to copy the index.php and the htaccess file and move them to the root of the project. And the index.php file has a very simple sample Spore application. Now you can see that instead of creating a new Slim application, we've created a new Spore application. Spore just extends Slim and adds a little bit of extra functionality. So let's see if it works. So I'm going to go through to Chrome, and there's a great Chrome extension called Advanced REST Client Application. And I'm going to query that root URL. And we can now see that it says hello world from Spore. And just to prove that I'm not lying, I'm going to add a couple of exclamation marks here and run it again. And we can see that there they are. Okay, so let's move on to the test service, which is provided with Spore, which has a few examples of how Spore works. Now, one of the key benefits of Spore is that it uses annotation-based routing to functions. So now, PHP doesn't have any native support for annotations, so I wrote a little library called docblock, which parses the doc blocks of classes and functions, and then does a little bit of magic so that you can use something like this. So you can put in a URL annotation with the URL that you want it to go through, and then acceptable HTTP verbs that are available as a comma delimited list, or I should say definable as a comma delimited list. And when you call this URL with this HTTP verb, it will execute this function and return this data. So let's give that a bash. So now we can see that we get a JSON response with some complex data. So some complex data in an array with nesting. And we can see that that data matches up to what we're returning out of the function here. The other thing that Spore does for you is that it deserializes incoming requests and serializes outgoing requests. And we'll get to that a little bit later. So let's move on to example 2. The default parameters of a auto route, as it's called. An auto route is a function that responds to a certain URL that's defined with these annotations. So the two default parameters of an auto route is the request object and the response object for 1 and 2. Now these request and response objects aren't the request and response objects from Slim, but rather little utility classes that simplify things, but also do have references to the actual Slim request objects in case you needed to use them. So a simple example here, let's just set a status code by setting response.status and then using this status class, which has a bunch of constants with all the different HTTP status codes, to create it. So that's 201, and this function will return true. So let's go to example 2, and now we can see return true and we get a 201. If we wanted to change this to something else like bad gateway, there we go, 502 bad gateway. Okay, example 3. This function is a simple addition resource, and it allows you to have two named parameters, which it will then convert to integers, and it will return the addition of those two integers. And you can see here that we are accessing the params property on the request object and using the actual names that we defined here in the URI. So let's give that a shot. And you can see that it gives us the correct answer. I'm going to be blowing through all of these examples very quickly, and you can find all the documentation online in the GitHub repository where I go through all of this in a lot more detail. Example 4. Now here's an example of a post auto route. Now this one shows off a little bit of the functionality that Spore has, which allows you to send through different kinds of data in using the different HTTP methods, or rather the different ways that HTTP allows you to send data through, namely query strings, HTTP bodies, and parameters in the URL provided by Slim. So let's give that a try. So we're going to go to example 4. Let's put in my name, because that first named parameter is name. And I'm going to put in here surname, and then in the HTTP body we're going to send it some XML. So we're going to add in content type text XML, and now we're going to send that request through. So we get 3 arrays returned in JSON format. So let's go through each one of them. The first one says name Danny. And as you can see, the first thing that's returning is this params variable, which are the named parameters from the Slim URI. The second one is the query string params, and this right here is the query string, and we can see that that has been reduced down to that. And then we can also see our HTTP body, which was in XML, which has been deserialized and then converted to native PHP objects and then serialized back into JSON for the response. Okay, let's jump on to configurations. So if we go to configuration, we can see that there are a number of configuration options that we can change. So let's say, for example, that we wanted all of our responses to be XML because we're stuck back in the 90s. So we simply change that configuration value, and now you can see that the data is coming back as XML with a content type of application/XML. All of the acceptable content types in and out are available in the documentation. If we look at this response as well, we'll see that it's got gzip compression coming back in the headers, so we can also turn that off. And you can see now we don't have any content encoding to gzip. In Slim Framework, you have a debug mode setting, and with the debug mode setting, what that allows you to do is to set whether certain debugging features are enabled or not. Now, when you have the debug value set to true, Slim will give you an HTML response to exceptions that occur throughout the application. Now, we don't always necessarily want that, but let's just see what that does. So in example 4, I'm just going to go here and I'm going to say throw new exception exception from example 4. Now when we run this, we'll see an internal server error with a bunch of HTML given back to us. So if we navigate to this in the browser, let's just add get to our list of verbs so that we can view it in our browser. This is what it gives you. However, if you change your debug mode to false, then Spore will step in and it will handle those exceptions for you and encode the responses back into JSON or XML based on what you have in your configuration. And now you can see that that same exception is being fired, except it's being caught by Spore. So we can see our message, we can see our code, we can see which file it occurred in, and which line it occurred on. If we go back to our configuration and change this back to JSON, there we see a JSON response. And we'll be able to see it in here as well. Internal server error and a JSON response. Now that is coming up because of an internal default error handler that Spore has defined. So if we go to spore.php, we will see the default error handler on line 133. So you can see that first it's setting the content type to the default content type defined in your configuration. Then it is serializing some data. And then it is going to be halting the Slim application with a certain kind of error, and it's going to pass that serialized data. So we can actually define our own error handlers if we want to. So I'm going to copy this, and I'm going to go back to my index.php. So let's go app.set error handler. I'm just going to paste this in and reformat it a little bit. So we change all of this references to app, and then we've got to add our namespaces for these different classes. So first thing I want to do is I want to change this to a 403. No, rather, let's change this to bad gateway or bad request, for example. Not that that's necessarily the right one, but just to give you an example of how this works. So we can see now it's responding with the 400 instead of a 500 as before. We can also reduce this down to just giving us the message from that exception. And you can see that there. Slim also has a way to handle 404 errors gracefully when your debug mode is set to false. So let's set the not found handler. The not found handler doesn't need any arguments. And we're going to set the message to the resource at, then we can go to the app's request object and get the resource URI. Does not exist. And we can change this to a 404. And now we just have to navigate to a service that doesn't exist. Example 10, we get a 404 error, and we can see there's our message with our nice error message coming back. Once again, if we turn on debugging, we will no longer get error exceptions anymore, but we will get our not found handlers. So if we jump back to our example 4, you can see that it's giving back the HTML again. Okay, now let's have a look at authentication. One of the features that Spore has is it gives you a very simple interface to protect certain auto routes in your Spore application. So let's have a look at example 6. Now example 6 has an extra annotation, and that annotation is auth. Now you can define the auth annotation to have a comma delimited list of acceptable roles. Now a role can be anything. It can be an identifier for certain users, but typically I like to think of it in this way. So I'm just giving it a role of restricted. So when this auto route is attempting to be contacted, Spore will say, okay, we need to first find out if this role is authenticated to use this function. So by default, Spore will let all authentication requests go through by default without any question. So if we go through to example 6 and we choose get, it says you made it, which means that this function executed. But what we can define is we can define a callback function which will allow us to define whether a user of a certain role will be allowed to or not allowed to access a certain auto route. So I'm just going to get rid of these for now. And let's go app.set auth set auth callback, and it accepts one parameter called roles. Now the way that the authentication works is if the auth callback returns true, it will let the resource actually execute, and if it returns false, then it will return an exception. So if we put in here return true, you will see no change in the operation of that resource. But if we add false, you will see that now we get an exception, a 401 unauthorized status, and we get a message saying you're not authorized to execute this function. So we can add in our own logic here to determine whether a certain user will be allowed to access this auto route. So what I'm putting in here is a very simple example of how you might accomplish this. So I've got a theoretical user. The theoretical user is Danny, and in the roles that are passed to this auth callback, which are coming from here, by the way, if the role Danny is in those roles, then it will return true. If not, it will return false. And when we run this, sure enough, we get a 401. But now if we change the current role to restricted, it passes. So that's how you use authentication. What you can also do is you can add an auth failed callback handler, auth failed handler rather. So we're going to add that in. It doesn't require any arguments. And over here, what we're going to do is we're going to say app.halt status dot let's make it forbidden. And let's just say sorry bud, no access. And if we change this to unrestricted so that it will fail, 403 forbidden, and there we see our message. So that's just a quick overview of what Spore can do. Check out the Git repository, which will be attached to this video, and have a look inside the documentation for some detailed explanation of how Spore works. And thanks for watching.